Women's Studies at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Quinn received her PhD from the University of Georgia in 1973 in experimental psychology, but has become interested in women's issues and women's studies since. Forthcoming this year is a book which she has written on counseling rape victims, which will be published by Prager. Also coming out soon is a book that she has edited on integrating new scholarship on women and minorities into the psychology curriculum. That will be published by the American Psychological Association. Today she's speaking on educating women in science, students and teachers' dilemmas. Dr. Quinn?
Thanks, Joan, and I'm delighted to be here. I know some of you, and I work with some of your great graduates, many of whom have worked with Joan, so it's really very nice for me to be here. In 1973, I was a new PhD, as Joan's mentioned. I was specializing in the psychophysics of vision, and I had my own visions that I was going to link the brain's cellular responses to visual stimuli, and I was going to discover how the visual system really works. I was not a feminist. I was one of those post-feminists we hear so much about today. We had them back then, too. It's nothing new. The struggle was over. Women could do anything they wanted, and I could make it by myself, thank you. I was fully aware of the extra attention I got from all those famous men around me in my male-dominated field, and thought it could only work to my advantage. As you can see from the introduction, 14 years later, I am a very different person. Today's talk is not just my story, but I think my experiences are relevant to the dilemmas and the solutions that I hope we can explore. I'm going to describe several dilemmas that women in science experience, both as teachers and as students. I'd like to start, though, with a bit of background to set the stage for this. In 1983-84, 25 women scientists and philosophers of science from all across the Northeast participated in a seminar designed to promote the integration of women's studies into the curriculum. This seminar was funded by the Mellon Foundation and was held at the Wellesley Center for Research on Women. The first 2 years, the seminar had focused quite successfully on integrating scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. They were introducing female authors into the survey literature course, talking about portrayal of women in art, analyzing gender role, socialization, introductory sociology, things like that. Our group now gathered to work on feminist curriculum change in mathematics and the natural sciences, and I was there as an experimental psychologist teaching research methods. Within the first 2 hours of the first meeting, we discovered we had a problem. The intent of this seminar, the reason they got the bucks from Mellon's, was to change the curriculum to reflect scholarship on women and gender. But where do women fit in the content of a field like organic chemistry? Somebody from the humanities who happened in suggested that we should just reject science and reject its methods because it was cold, sterile, and all those other things. Needless to say, that idea bombed. We liked our various sciences, and we weren't too unhappy with our methods. What we did not like was, I guess, best described as the environment of doing science. The struggle to become a scientist as a woman, the treatment of women once they made it into science, the social and political biases that often direct research, and the traditional way in which science has been taught. These issues then became our focus for the year of the seminar. The first dilemma I'm going to talk about could be labeled the feminist scientist which am I dilemma, although it applies to many feminists studying in male-dominated areas outside women's studies in addition to science. The women in our group were usually the only woman in their home department, and they felt terribly isolated there. They saw feminism and social issues and social activism of various types, the peace movement, other movements, as extremely important, but not relevant to their research and teaching. Most were trying to manage two separate lives in two separate spheres. Their scientific university world, and then their feminist, private, social activist, non-university world, which was usually relegated to weekends and evenings when they could get them free. For these women, the dilemma was, where could their feminism fit in their professional lives? Some of us, when faced with this sense of fragmentation, had sort of given up and left our isolated laboratories and started to apply our research skills to questions about gender in women's studies, becoming philosophers of science in some cases, or interdisciplinary scholars. We loved the intellectual exchange and social support we got from working with the other women in women's studies. And we felt like we were doing interesting research on topics of importance to society, and yet each of us, in talking about these issues among the women in the seminar, each of us still expressed some sense of sadness that we'd had to give something up. We'd had to give up that original laboratory environment, those questions that we had so hotly pursued when we were graduate students. So we still felt in some way that we'd had to compromise. The dilemma for us was, where could our science fit now in our feminist professional world? So these questions became my focus in much of that year in working with feminist teaching. And one of the things I'll share with you today are some of the options that other scientists and I have developed in our own processes of working this dilemma out. But first, more dilemmas. There are plenty more. During that year at Wellesley, a smaller group of us formed a sort of a small discussion group on personal issues and started working on a dilemma that I've called Barriers to Achievement, Just When Do I Give Up? For one of our monthly meetings, we encouraged the whole group to examine our own lives by writing autobiographies of our paths into, and in some cases out of, science. Interestingly enough, only 6 of the 25 of us ever completed our histories. And we found it a very difficult task, primarily because it dredged up an extraordinary amount of personal pain, and frequently we didn't even know that pain was there until we began writing these autobiographies. We found ourselves telling, sometimes for the first time, what turned out to be very common experiences: tokenism, isolation, rejection, and other barriers to to achieving our potential. Although we did find some inspiring examples of survivorship among us. Some of these barriers were direct denials of opportunity: lower grades, lost assistantships, job discrimination, lower pay, tenure denied. Other barriers were more like threats. Evelyn, a computer scientist from Digital Equipment Corporation, had entered Spelman College, which is a historical black institution, with 4 other ambitious young black women. There, she was told she couldn't enter engineering because her SAT math scores were too low. She took some time out, studied on her own, and improved her SAT score in math 100 points, if you can imagine. She did that on her own, took the math books, went home, and came back. Once she was in the program, she was told she couldn't be an engineer because she was a woman. Transferring to Georgia Tech, she was told she couldn't be an engineer because she was black. After her bachelor's degree, she was admitted to a PhD program in physics at MIT, where she was told that she would have to repeat 2 undergraduate years because of deficiencies, although a white male from her same program with her same coursework was told he might have to take 1 extra course. Then, after successfully completing her master's and receiving highly positive reviews of her thesis research at a national conference, her major professor said, "Your work is adequate if all you plan to do is to teach blacks." It's extraordinary. Do other people feel the same pain? This story can make me cry just describing it. It was a very painful description. Only then did she give up. And it was just one barrier too many to fight. Her 4 friends from Spelman had long since left science. And how many more we don't know about. While Evelyn's case was extraordinarily painful and more than most of us had experienced, All but one member of our group described at least one such decision point. Do I fight this, or do I give up and leave science? There were more subtle but no less destructive barriers to these women's achievement in science. One was tokenism. You hear all about the advantages women and blacks have because of affirmative action. I'm sure you know the litany, but you don't often hear the real statistics. In spite of federal regulations prohibiting job discrimination, today women and minorities in science are still more likely than men to be under or unemployed, and not by choice. And lawsuits about these discriminations are likely to take 10 or more years. Once a female is hired, no more women or minorities need be hired, because everybody can point to her and say, see, we hired a woman, we don't discriminate. I literally heard that about 2 months ago from an engineering professor at URI. They have one woman in engineering there on the faculty. The last one didn't get tenure. Furthermore, the token woman's colleagues treat her as if she only got her job because of affirmative action, as if she couldn't or wouldn't have been competitive otherwise. At my first job, I was told things like, well, we didn't interview some really qualified men because we had to hire a woman, because we were replacing a woman. Along with, well, you got the job because you were better looking than the other woman candidate. The tragic part is, I began to believe those messages. After 4 or 5 people say those things to you, you start to think, well, maybe they're true. And it wasn't until a colleague finally gave me access to everyone's hiring records some months later that I discovered that I had more publications on hire than the sum total, the combined total of all the men that had been hired at my rank over the last several years. There are about 6 of them. Yet I, again, and today, I still believe that I would never have even been hired in that department as a legitimate colleague in spite of my record. Since I left, by the way, that department has continued to hire a woman every couple of years, and that woman leaves and they hire another woman. And they've never hired a woman into any other real faculty position, and they still haven't seen the pattern. Then there's the personal side of surviving in science, dealing with sexual harassment. I'm not sure why. Probably it's the fact that sciences are male-dominated, there's more men there, and the women in science are relatively powerless and can't prevent it. But it seems sexual harassment seems to be worse in the sciences. In one recent survey of women graduate students in a science where field trips are essential, every single woman had experienced sexual harassment. This is within a university setting. Now, how do you think you'd feel about undertaking a required field trip for a course, going alone in the woods or with a small group to the woods for about a week, knowing that you were going to have to deal with unwanted sexual advances from a field supervisor who could, of course, determine your grade? Not a very pleasant thought, and yet it has happened. Unfortunately, as with rape, the problems don't end with the harassing incident. The victim will be blamed, just as in rape. She asked for it, and she'll never be a good professional because she doesn't know how to handle relationships with men appropriately. That's where that little professional dig. Furthermore, a sexual image comes to undercut her competence. I remember hearing stories about the 2 women who were already in my graduate program before I arrived at Georgia. True or untrue, and I suspect largely untrue, the stories were always accompanied by the implication that these 2 women were only allowed to stick around in graduate school because of their sexual liaisons with professors, not because they were highly qualified. Finally, for the women in our group, there were some painful personal choice dilemmas. Cutting-edge scientific research, which is the stuff that we all aspire to at some level, is carried out in a culture of its own, a culture that demands more than 8 hours a day, which demands that research be placed above personal needs and relationships. My brother's an organic chemist who sometimes puts in 12 hours a day at the lab. Note, though, that I'm talking about a culture that demands an enormous amount of time. The work itself could probably be done in less time. or in more reasonable ways, cooperative ways. But the social demand is that if you want to succeed, you'd better be in there, usually isolated in your lab, putting in your time, kind of like the corporation. I've talked to women who've changed fields or who decided to become teachers rather than researchers, even though they loved the research part, because they felt that the culture that they were entering was just incompatible with the rest of their life. And it's usually the woman scientist, not the man, who is forced to see her career path as this kind of choice between family and science. My brother has a lovely patient wife and 4 children who are fed and clean and ready to play with him when he does come home. For him, there has never been a dilemma. But, we say, things have changed. More men are accepting women as full colleagues. More women are being hired. We have ways to deal with sexual discrimination and sexual harassment. Women have proven that they are as good as men in science. In spite of the awful experiences the 25 women in our group described, they felt they had made it, and they had. They did feel respected and competent, and above all, they loved their work. Furthermore, they were all engaged in encouraging women as students or as colleagues or potential colleagues to follow their paths, to enter their science. For all we'd gone through, we were a pretty positive bunch. Yet women are not flocking to science in droves. In psychology, which is now running over 50% women in graduate school enrollments, fields like social and clinical attract women, and the hard science, as they refer to it, areas like computer modeling, cognitive science, physiological, still attract mostly men. In mathematics and engineering, where women now constitute over 1/3 of undergraduate majors, something again happens after graduation. Less than 10% of graduate admissions in those areas are women, and even fewer receive their PhDs. Why aren't women entering science? What are the dilemmas for women students? The first student dilemma can be described as the women can't do science problem. Over the past 150 years, we have been fed with a constant barrage of biological reasons why women aren't as smart as men, why we can't think abstractly, can't do problem solving, or can't do math. 120 years ago, the new Darwinians concluded that women hadn't evolved far enough to be intellectual, and thus shouldn't be in science. 100 years ago, it was that our brains were smaller than men's, and thus couldn't hold as much. 60 years ago, it was believed that women's bodies were like a fixed energy system, and that our ovaries were inextricably linked to our brains. Use your brains, your ovaries will shrivel up. Use your ovaries, there's no brains left. You know, these are very funny beliefs, but they were serious scientific beliefs during those times, and they were put up as real scientific facts. 40 years ago, it was the Y gene. 20 years ago, it was testosterone that was thought to give men their superior problem-solving ability. While women, with our X's and our estrogen, were better suited for fine motor activity. That translates into typing. Things that didn't require much thinking. Today, we have theories about a special combination of genes and hormones that create differential brain structures that again, make men better thinkers than women. The message is always the same. Women are biologically inferior. The media has certainly helped promote these views. How many of you have ever heard something like, women can't do math? Or men are mathematical, women are verbal. Women are right-brained, men are left-brained. I'm sure you've heard some of these. If not, let me tell you, your parents and teachers probably have heard them. This kind of image has been promoted in headlines that have appeared in the Providence Journal and in popular magazines like Time, Playboy, and in ads for other so-called science magazines over the past few years. Are men smarter than women? Researchers say yes. What's the problem with math? Girls. That was a Providence Journal headline. And just this past August, in the Sunday Journal was a large article starting out, "Educators try to figure out why boys outscore girls in math. Now believe cause is biological." Oops, sorry. Now with this kind of press coverage, there's got to be some heavy research data there, right? Yeah, it should be. How many studies do you think were done to get this headline? Again, this has been going on for about at least 7 years, and we've been collecting headlines like this. About every 6 months one appears. Basically one that's been, there's one with some follow-up work, a couple of follow-up works, but based on the same database. In 1980, Benbow and Stanley gave the SAT to a group of mathematically talented high school students. These students were specially selected across the country because they were doing extremely well in mathematics. In this group, which represents the top 1 in 10,000 high school students in mathematics, boys outnumber girls. Benbow and Stanley believe this difference is genetic because they can't find any other explanation. But the headlines on these newspaper articles I've described to you, and there are many, many more, never explain about the subject population. Nor do they ever ask about the other 9,999 of us and how we're doing, thank you. In fact, a number of other good research projects have demonstrated that the SAT scores that we see are influenced by math courses taken, the attitudes one has towards mathematics, the cultural pressure on males versus females to take math, parental expectations that boys versus girls will do well in math, math anxiety, and a number of other factors. And in particular, these factors act to keep women's scores slightly lower than men's scores on the average nationally. But there is no evidence that young women as a group are inferior to men in mathematics because of any genetic or hormonal or brain structure factor. I should mention that there is no brain structure ever found to differentiate men from women except for a tiny area of the hypothalamus responsible for regulating the hormonal cycles which allow us to do our reproductive thing, menstrual cycles. And ovulation. That's it, regardless of any other claims you hear. Some research on this topic was done in Rhode Island by Mary Canarian, who earned her master's degree here in psychology at Rick with Joan Rollins, and then came to URI for her PhD in psychology. She saw these headlines and got concerned about her high school-age daughter's chances given this kind of press. For her dissertation, she went to an upper-middle-class school system in Rhode Island and looked at math test scores, coursework, and attitudes towards mathematics. In this particular population, in this school system, where college was expected for both male and female high school students, she found no differences in either 8th grade aptitude test scores or the senior year SAT mathematics test scores. However, she did find some other important differences. Males considered math to be more important to their careers, and they reported higher levels of encouragement to study math, particularly from their mothers. Not from their teachers or their fathers, as one might want to claim, but from their mothers. Her conclusion in that regard has been that mothers don't necessarily understand how important math is to their daughters either, because they have been raised in this same cultural environment. These two social factors, which are independent of ability, have important consequences for women students. In 1972, Lucy Sells looked at the women students entering Berkeley as freshmen. She found that only 8% of women freshmen had taken the high school math courses required for being admitted into 2/3 of the majors. And those majors, of course, were science, math, engineering, computer science courses. Some 92% of the women students were shut out of 2/3 of the majors before they ever walked in the door at Berkeley because of their high school mathematics. Now, that's improved over the years. That was a 1972 study. However, the high school studies that Mary Canarian studied in 1982 were showing signs of doing the same thing. Furthermore, no one was telling these young women how important it is to stick it out and take that mathematics. Canarian found a critical pattern in this regard that differentiated men and women. For men, not only was there more encouragement to study math, but that encouragement was a generalized encouragement and wasn't related to their individual ability. It was a general message to men. For women, on the other hand, only those who had scored well on their 8th grade ability tests were encouraged to study math. Okay, you got ability, you go ahead and study it, but the rest of you, you don't need it. That was the general message coming across. This research story has a particular irony to it. As Mary was preparing to defend her dissertation, I happened to meet a woman whose daughter was in the 6th grade in the very same school system. She told me she was worried. Although her daughter was a straight-A student in math, her daughter's 6th grade teacher had just told her, well, at that age the girls do better than the boys, but by high school, 2/3 of the boys do better than any of the girls. Don't get your hopes up. How could this teacher misperceive the reality so badly? And what impact did his comments have on this woman and on her daughter as soon as she comes home with her first bad grade in math? I've seen a particular effect of this message, that we don't have it in us to do math anyway, through my work at URI. The reality is that men hate math as much as women, and they sometimes do as badly, they do as badly and sometimes worse than women in classes. My role on the appeals committee for academic standing at URI showed me an important difference, though. The guys in engineering and mathematics would make Fs, they'd take the course over, get a D, go on to the next class. After all, math classes generally get easier, not harder, the further you go. That's a little secret they don't often tell you. Guys flunk out when they get too many Fs. They go somewhere else, take a few courses, get readmitted the next year, and never miss a beat. And they go on in engineering. They finally graduate, sometimes barely over the academic minimum. Sometimes that's why they're appealing. And the company that hires them could care less. They'll make the same salary as the straight-A woman, probably more. On the other hand, I talk to women who make an A- in a math course, think they're a failure, they'll never be able to go on, and they never take another math course. They change their majors sometimes. They drop their dreams of becoming an engineer or a scientist because they're afraid that they might make less than an A-. We have a serious self-esteem problem. And headlines like the ones we've talked about, a constant barrage of social messages saying, you can't do it anyway, it's just a matter of time before you really fail. Those messages don't help. With students, as with the teachers, there are also personal dilemmas, perhaps described better as personal fears. Math and science have an image problem. There's no question about that. They aren't a place for women. They're not necessarily a place for men. It goes back to that old pseudoscientific theory, I figure. You use your brain in science and your ovaries are going to shrink up. Your womanhood, or whatever that essence is, will disappear. Perhaps the most common concerns I hear from young women, and they are concerns that I felt myself all the way through undergraduate and graduate school, believe me, they're those nagging personal questions. What will other people think of me? Will I have friends? Will they all leave me? Will I have a boyfriend, husband, lover, partner, or any kind of relationship? Will people think I'm a nerd or weird? Unfortunately, the media seems to pick up on these images of both male and female scientists as people so far out on the social scale that they're not really human. Witness the nerd in Peggy Sue Got Married, or the scientist, that weird scientist in Back to the Future, or any other movie you can think about recently. When women do make contributions to science, you don't hear about them, usually, or you hear about them in a way that makes them sound a little socially strange. When the fact that Rosalind Franklin had actually been as much responsible for the discovery of DNA as Watson and Crick, although they, not she, received the Nobel Prize, Watson and others talked about her in derogatory personal terms, calling her Rosie, talking about her asocial habits, and suggesting she was just a wee bit hysterical and probably wouldn't have wanted the publicity surrounding the Nobel Prize anyway. When in 1983 Barbara McClintock became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize in science for her genetics research, the media portrayed her as an eccentric, maybe even crazy, little old lady who lived an isolated, lonely life. Although the men who'd studied and worked with her praised her and her intellectual and social relationships with them. Hearing all these descriptions, students' fears are understandable. I wouldn't want to enter a science like that either. Who among us aspires to be rejected as a person, regardless of how much we love our science? Well, my seminar didn't spend all year, as some would say, bitching, and I don't plan to spend that today either. We looked for solutions, resolutions, and for some revolutions. I chose to focus on ways in which the average scientist, like myself, could promote a feminist science. Rather than attacking the content of science, though, I concluded that we first need to transform the environments of science, particularly the laboratory and the classroom. Here are some of the ways I found other feminist scientists making such changes. The first transformation is organizational, sort of a systemic change. Women scientists need a way to gain the support and intellectual stimulation that others have found in women's studies, to feel that their feminism and their personal lives, their professional lives, are more integrated. Women's studies programs have been of little help to women in science, most women in science, primarily and understandably because women's studies has been defined as a content area, the study of women and or gender. Those women who teach only their regular science courses, however creatively they teach them, have been left alone to sort of tough it out over there. And some of the women I talked to, who are women still in science and not in women's studies, really felt this very painfully and felt that in some ways they had been rejected and abandoned by women's studies, which as a person in women's studies sounded terrible to me. Ironically, some of the work that's most fascinating right now in women's studies has been the critique of the patriarchal structure and practice of science. And we clearly need to attract more feminist scientists to carry out a reconstruction of all of science. How can we encourage and then include this new breed of women in science who don't necessarily study women as content, but nevertheless bring forth a gender-relevant perspective? We in women's studies can view this dilemma actually as a guiding light for a new realm of feminist studies, maybe serving as a base for the development of this new ideal, starting by broadening the concept of a feminist curriculum. The Mellon seminars I participated in defined feminist curriculum as one that had women in it, as a content area. I feel that instead we need to focus on the goals rather than the content of the curriculum. A feminist science, if it is ever achieved, is not going to be described by its topics or its methods, but it will have a set of common goals. And I propose that they'll look something like this. 1, the scholarship must be accurate and comprehensive. This is like a textbook. Gender bias and stereotypes have no place. Wherever gender is relevant, The research, theory, and applications must be subject to explicit gender analysis. We have to look and see what's going on when we talk about gender. And wherever gender is relevant, the material must be based on the lives of women as well as the lives of men. For example, I've seen teachers illustrate methodological points like probability statistics with gender-biased examples such as the probability of picking up blondes versus redheads in a bar. And they're not talking about men, picking up men. That kind of differential example has been shown in several research studies to actually affect the learning of men and women differently. So it's not just a matter of insulting us, it's a matter of affecting how we learn. Erasing these kinds of bias should become part of a conscious effort, an ongoing conscious effort to achieve gender balance. The second goal is that women and men must have equal access to science. Women scientists must not be treated differently from men, and we must especially work to eliminate well-documented patterns of discouraging girls and women from enrolling in math and science courses. And we must eliminate discriminatory treatment of those students while taking those courses. Third, women must have an equal role in the creation of science so that our visions must stand alongside, or better yet, be integrated with, views created by men. Without a corpus of feminist men and women creating science, we will see little in the way of real transformation. The second area of challenge is to science teachers, to make these feminist goals relevant in the students' environment for learning science, in the classroom and the teaching laboratory. A number of scholars have been working towards a feminist learning environment by transforming the pedagogy of science, that is, the way we teach it. Generally, feminist teaching involves respect for the student, learning as a two-way process, and the acquisition of knowledge as a means of empowerment, making us as individuals stronger. Some of that's just good teaching sense, and in the sciences, that's sometimes been very much lacking, with the traditional view that, well, if you're a good researcher, you'll be a good teacher. I don't need to know about that stuff. Another set of transformations are part of a movement near and dear to my heart, the critical thinking skills movement. In this rapidly changing information era, where's my language? In this rapidly changing information era, where theories have a pretty short life, so rapid turnover in theoretical views, some of us have taken the position that the best we can give our students are the skills with which to evaluate new data and to change on their own. Other innovative pedagogies address the women can't do science problem. Dorothy Burke of Ithaca College has developed a writing course in mathematics, a sneaky way to help math avoidant students realize they can do math. She utilizes an intuitive problem-solving approach based on the work of Carol Gilligan, which, as she noted, is actually the way mathematical researchers do their stuff. That's how they do their math research. It's not absolute, logical, rational. It's very much intuitive, gray, guessing, what-if kind of research. So in the long run, this kind of pedagogy should be better for all students, men and women. Blythe Clinchy and her associates have recently published the results of an extensive study of learning styles in college women called Women's Ways of Knowing, which gives us considerable food for thought about the new ways for transmitting knowledge to our students. A third area in which we can transform our science environment is in the perspective we offer. We have a tendency to teach, and sometimes to believe, that science is objective, value-free, rational, and somewhat final. I agree. My favorite example comes from a televised physics course in which the instructor is illustrating with a demonstration the principle, again this is a physics course, of force equals mass times acceleration, using a dart gun to shoot a stuffed monkey. As he does this, as he performs a demonstration, he laughs and says, "The ethics of shooting a monkey a monkey, of course, are not our problem. We're concerned only about hitting the target accurately using our formula. We need to step back, gaining a broader and more historical worldview, and start balancing the ideals of science and what we can do accurately with our formulas with more realistic problems. Values and politics have influenced research and science in many ways. The area studied, the different ways that results are interpreted, which studies and which results get published, and what the media likes to report. Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man offers many such examples in the area of intelligence testing. There are also powerful examples of how warfare has influenced the questions asked. In physics, as in missiles and Star Wars, which is a current impact. Chemistry, where chemical warfare is influencing the kind of chemistry being funded right now. So we can develop the new binary weapon systems. They're actually funding researchers who are doing basic chemical research that someday hopefully hopefully, I put that in quotes, will give us bigger and better chemical weapons. So you're reinforced for doing that kind of research by federal grants. Even in psychology, where do you think we got all of our subjects for the research demonstrating specific brain mechanisms? We used war victims, men who had had specific refined areas of their skull and their brains taken out by a bullet hole. That's where we got all that research from. The uses and abuses of our technology must also become relevant. The third world women who suffer from reckless experimentation on their bodies, exploitation of their environment for atmospheric testing or hazardous chemical research, and the use of our latest weaponry. Those women must be considered alongside the mathematics and engineering of those technologies. And the notion that the scientific method and laboratory experiments are the only way to achieve knowledge has been the source of a great deal of ignorance about women's lives. That notion was a reason why rape and abuse victims, who of course were mostly women, were not legitimate areas of scholarly activity because they weren't accessible to study through our, quote, quantitative objective techniques. In psychology now, new qualitative and quantitative methods have become available, which have the potential to bring together data and experience in a somewhat objective way. We must appreciate and teach others these new tools for discovery alongside our traditional methods. And we must check out our findings by talking to those who've had the experiences we are researching. Within this transformed perspective, there must be an explicit analysis of the ways in which gender and gender bias have shaped the language and theories of science. If you're interested in this area, I highly recommend Evelyn Fox Keller's book, Reflections on Gender and Science. It should convince you that gender is relevant to science, even if you're working with sexless slime molds. The fourth transformation must be the creation of a comfortable place for women and minorities in science. One of the greatest stresses for anyone, and in my experience the most frequent reason for competent women and minorities and non-traditional men leaving science, is a feeling that one doesn't belong, particularly the discomfort of working in an environment that is hostile. One way to create this new place, I envision, is to provide role models. Anne Fausto Sterling and Lydia English taught a course at Brown University called Women and Minorities in Science, in which students actively engaged in the process of historical research, of finding their role models and discovering them, often for the first time. At the end of the semester, they published a lovely book on their newly discovered foremothers and fathers, which then has served as a text for subsequent classes. It's a nice process kind of way of doing this role modeling. Less obvious tactics include naming the scientists whose work we talk about and giving a bit of personal history about them, while making sure that we include women, minorities, disabled scientists, or otherwise non-traditional folks. A second way in which women have been transforming the scientific workplace is by creating support groups. These groups meet regularly, providing a safe place to discuss fears and problems and other issues. Among other outcomes, women students have begun to take classes together and form study groups, that support and help. Educational projects have been developed to combat sexual harassment. Women faculty have formed cooperative research programs, and alliances have been formed between faculty and students. A concrete example of the impact of such support came at the end of our seminar at Wellesley when Evelyn, the computer scientist I told you about, left DEC to re-enter graduate school at Harvard in the history of science, largely because of the help and support of other women in the group. When creating a place for women, we must also consider the social system in which science is carried out. The lab society, which alienates its members from their family and from the real world, has to distort their value systems. Those of us making it to the inside of these social systems need to work to transform them into more humane environments for the health and sanity of men and women. Even in less hostile environments, women and minorities frequently aren't socialized adequately about the system, and we do less well because we don't know the implicit rules or the ways to gain power. In a newly published book called Advice for Women Scholars, edited by Susanna Rose, women discuss ways they have coped with these system issues, from graduate school through tenure. This book has been recommended by at least 2 reviewers as a must-have for every advisor's shelf. I'm pleased to have been able to contribute a couple of papers to that book, but sorry to say that they reflect how much I had to learn and how long it took me to learn it the hard way. Let's make it easier for others to survive, even thrive, without having to overcome quite so many barriers. Finally, we can't forget that we are all role models, students and teachers alike. Our success in integrating our womanhood, our political beliefs, and our science, or whatever we do professionally, is under constant scrutiny and may well serve as a model for the future. We have the imperative of the next generation, not merely our own personal needs, urging us to pursue this feminist transformation. We have to show students and others around us that we're not the kind of people to be afraid of, as those images have projected for so many generations. And neither are those women, by the way, that they talk about, like the Barbara McClintocks. We must be visible and available as the kind of women others would like to become, competent, caring, and as diverse and interesting as any other group of women you can find. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Any questions? Question. Yeah.
I have to make this comment.
Yeah.
Just looking around at the handful of faculty members who are here, like they become, we become, and then too. It's obvious to me that the wrong ones are here. In other words, the ones who really need to hear your message don't come to a talk like this, very kind of contact with. And I hope you were videotaping it. I hope there's some way that we could communicate.
Sneak it in their room, label it, one of the movies, go out to Major Video or someplace and get little labels and make them think it's one of those movies. It's interesting. Put an X on it or something and give it to them. Yeah, that's an important point, and it is always a frustrating thing to feel that the converted are here. And there are people here, Anne's here, people who have done some really nice stuff in this. I urge those of you who are students here to get to know as many professors in this room as possible. I think you'll find some real exciting stuff is going on here. How many of you are going into science or engineering or, yeah? Stick with it. Don't let them tell you otherwise. That's great. Any others? How about the others of you? Have you thought about it and maybe changed your mind somewhere along the line?
We have a lot of students here going to graduate school in psychology, but they don't
Okay.
consider that science, apparently. How many are going to graduate school in psychology?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I thought more of you said you were.
They're not admitting it. Yeah. I think it's an interesting problem. We do have people tending to go, and I do advising all the time, and most of my students are going into areas that aren't considered the sort of hard science areas. Maybe what we can do is start helping people at least make decisions based on a full range of options. It's not that going into clinical psychology is a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing, or social psychology, or any of the other areas that women have so far been going into. But we have to let people feel like they're doing it because they want to, because it's a chosen field, and not because they can't do math or can't do science. Yeah.
One of the comments you made during your talk was how men tend to tell women that they're not good in math and stuff like that. Well, I was in a math course at the college, and I got an A in it, and one of the boys in the class had said to me, "Oh, you shouldn't be in this kind of field because you just won't do well in it, whereas, like I will and stuff, but you won't." And he ended up flunking the class, and I ended up getting an A in it. And I was like, oh, I just felt it, I saw him the next semester, and he's like, oh, did you make it through the class? And I said, yes, I did with an A. Thank you,
That's great. It's a good thing you didn't listen, too.
Yeah.
To that kind of thing. One finds that the people who say those things are frequently suffering from their own self-esteem problems. The reason they have to put you down is because they themselves feel they can't do it. But it's a real tough thing.
I thought one of the most interesting things you were saying is how the social environment in a lot of engineering firms or science-related firms are not conducive for a woman. I can't explain it.
Or for humanity, but yeah.
That's true. Like they want you to be able to put in 10-hour days and 12-hour days, and if you actually go there, you don't find that they're actually working for 10 or 12 hours, but it's like 2-hour lunch breaks and so on. And for a woman who's trying to raise a family, and even for a man who's trying to raise a family, it's really difficult. And in fact, impossible. In fact, I changed my mind from I was going to go for a PhD in chemistry and decided to get a master's instead and work at my career more slowly than I had originally planned because of that. But what can be done to change that? I mean, I'm not finding that changing. And I was hoping something can be done through the legislature to create child care situations in the workplace and so on. And I don't really see that moving very quickly.
It's not, and you're right. The most hopeful things I've seen are, first of all, partnerships where a husband or a wife, and it depends on the relationship, decides that they will take over primary care of the children while the other partner puts in a lot more hours, at least in the initial years of making it into the system, in the academic or other kinds of system. And there are men who have taken on that role of doing the primary child care. But I think what may make the difference down the line is the same thing that's made the difference in some other areas, and that is that we get more men who are aware of the need to spend, or their own wishes to spend more time with their children, more men in power, and they may someday change the system. It's a tough one, and I suspect that what we may see are some lawsuits or things like that eventually breaking into the scientific field, saying, you can't require me to spend. No company can require you to do, if you're at a staff level, a secretarial level, say, to spend more than your hours of time without extra compensation. Now, what are you going to do about me in science? It's a tough one. It's a real tough one, and I feel for women making those decisions, and I've had to make some of my own between the lab and the real world. I talked to when I was just finishing my degree, I talked to one of those famous scientist men at one of those conferences who was giving me lots of attention about that issue. It always happens. And I said, I'm just really scared because I don't know that I can spend the kind of hours in the laboratory that it's going to require for me to be as famous as I want to be. And it was a real tough thing for him. And he said that he himself had changed his mind over the years. He had done that route. And I guess what had happened was that his wife had died very suddenly, and he was off at the lab. And it took something of that major proportion to sort of change his thinking. But he said, I don't do it anymore either. I spend a lot more time outside the lab. Of course, it was easy for him to say. He's already famous. That's a tough one. But I think maybe more of that kind of experience among men may start to change it. That's the only way I see. Oh, maybe not. I mean, look how rapidly women have entered science. I understand that women in medical school, maybe that's another good example. Women in medical school are very much making some changes. With the way that the interns and residents are trained is just absolutely inhumane. These 36-hour shifts and no sleep, no ability to go home and be a human being, those sorts of things. I understand that women medical students, now that they're constituting, about 50% of medical school students or something close to that, are really making some changes. So maybe it'll work the same way. Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad you said that, because I was sitting here thinking, it may be true that women are reluctant or hesitant about going into math and science, but we're also hesitant about it and reluctant to believe that we can make a change in the way political and social and organizational systems are organized. And it seems to me that one of the most helpful things is assertiveness training, either real direct on-hand assertiveness training or just reading about being assertive or having a core group, where women can learn, no matter what field they're going into, and this might include business too, that it's okay for them to say, gee, I don't choose to have a 2-hour lunch. I'll join you for an hour, but I have a different kind of schedule that I work with. Okay, because I'm said I want to be home at 5 o'clock with my kids and whatever. I think it's really important for women to feel comfortable about changing the way things have always been done. And of course, the barrier there is that if you don't fit into the organizational system, whether it's a science or a corporation, you don't get invitations and you don't get into the old boys network and so forth. But I think women are learning that they can form the old girls network and that they can have an impact. And I think that's where we need to help our students.
Nicely said. I like that, yeah. How do you get her to do this? What got me up here for? She's good. Yeah. No, I agree. That's a very good point, that we sort of think we can't make a difference, and we have made a difference in a number of ways. I've watched this system work at URI in the psychology department, where we've grown to 6 women on the faculty out of like 22, starting from a much lower base of about 2 women a few years back. And each time we add another woman into the staff, we've had to go through a lot of struggle. Sometimes we've had to pull out every single assertiveness trick we've got in our entire bag, and fight a lot of the old boys network moves. But with each additional person, it becomes much easier. And it also creates a different environment. So the department, in fact, has shifted dramatically, I think, in the last few years. So that's a good point. Yeah. Other ideas? There's something I was going to follow up on. Oh, well. I'll think of it tomorrow, I'm sure. In terms of encouraging women to... Oh, I know what it was. The other thing that we tend to do is that in terms of taking those math courses and getting our grades, is we tend to say, if we got the A, we tend to say, it was luck. As opposed to saying, it was because I'm darn good in mathematics and I can do this stuff. We have a real tendency to say, oh, I was just lucky this time. Whereas many others, and some research suggests it's more males than females. Other research doesn't necessarily suggest this. But anyway, I've seen a lot of males say, well, I had a bad teacher, I had a bad semester, I had all these other reasons why I didn't get an A. So we've got women making A's saying, I was just lucky, and men making C's saying, I had a lousy teacher. When women make C's, they say, I'm not good at this, I can't do this. Whereas when men make A's, they say, I'm good at this, I can do this. And we have to start thinking about our attributions and using our personal awareness and our personal attributions more. Taking that feedback. When the teacher says you did a good job, don't go, gee, this teacher likes me. Go, gee, I did a good job. We have to start rethinking the way we take feedback in. Yeah.
I just had one comment for the budding chemist back there that stems from your medical school. You're right, with 50% of the medical school classes now being female, which is more females than are going into nursing, that's a heck of a change in a lot less than a generation. 15 years ago, when I applied to graduate school and medical school, I was essentially told by the dean of admissions at a medical school that I could get into medical school as long as I was willing to go into pediatrics, because women could not do anything else at that point in time. 15 years later,
15
what
years.
heck of a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Isn't that extraordinary? You think these things happened back in the Dark Ages, that all these things I was describing happened long, long ago, and some of them did, but not many of them. It happened more recently. We have to learn how to overcome them, too. We have to learn how to prevent those 4 other women who didn't make it, along with Evelyn, from dropping out. We need to provide better support for them. Got a long way to go. We also need to take our time out to rest in between struggling against all these things. So we need to take our weekends and rest and things like that.
Develop a social life so you're well-rounded.
Yes, yes.
That's the serious thing.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody who wants to talk to me later is welcome to. I'll stay around for a little while. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to invite any of you who care to join us for lunch in Donovan. We'll sit at a table there and can continue the discussion with Dr. Quinn if you'd like to.